Hello and welcome to the 10-minute Quran study, the place where a dead Macedonian king blows a hole into the standard Islamic narrative. In Surah 18 verses 83 to 102 of the Quran, we learn about Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one. It is a most peculiar story which has puzzled Muslims for generations. In short, the two-horned one travels to the place of the sun's setting, where he punishes unjust people. The sun sets in murky water, and the two-horned one follows a mysterious path which takes him to the place of the sun's rising, where people do not have any shelter. From there, the two-horned one travels to a place where Gog and Magog threatened the people. To protect the people, he builds a wall of iron and brass, prophesying that the wall will only fall at the end of days. The passage ends with a warning that when the wall falls and Gog and Magog ravage the lands, the unbelievers will be cast into hell. So who is this two-horned one? Today, Muslims debate whether it is Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, or someone different entirely. But the truth is, we know exactly who it refers to: Alexander the Great, who was historically known as the two-horned one. After he conquered Egypt, Alexander visited the oracle of Amun in the Libyan desert, which revealed to him that his real father was the god Amun-Ra, who was called the two-horned, and whose symbol was the ram. That is why we also have many ancient coins depicting Alexander with ram-like horns. Those coins were the principal coinage in Arabia and the Levant for centuries. Depictions of Alexander with horns have been found in the former Byzantine Empire as late as the 7th century AD, which fits in neatly with the occurrence of the story in the Quran. Soon after Alexander's death in 323 BC, legendary accounts about his life start to emerge, culminating hundreds of years later in the entirely fictitious Alexander romances of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It is in the tradition of these romances that the Aramaic Alexander legend is written. Unlike many predecessors, it is clearly placed within a Christian context, starting out with Alexander praying to God, promising to obey the Messiah should he arrive during his lifetime, and being given his horns by God, granting him power over all of the earth. From here, the Aramaic Alexander legend matches the story within the Quran beat for beat, only it offers a lot more context. Alexander wants to learn about the outer edges of the world. His advisors warn him that the earth is surrounded by a fetid sea, like pus, and that to touch it means death. Alexander is however undeterred and marches westwards. On his way through Egypt, he picks up 7,000 Egyptian iron and brass workers who join his army, explaining how he could later build the iron and brass wall. From Egypt, he sets sail for 4 months and 12 days until he reaches a distant land beyond which is the fetid sea. He asks the locals if they have evildoers who are condemned to death and sends them into the fetid sea where they die immediately. These are the unjust people whom Alexander punishes in the Quran. Seeing the impossibility of crossing the fetid sea, Alexander gives up his plans to do so. Instead, he goes to a place of bright water where he finds the window of heaven, which the sun enters when it sets. Beyond the window is a conduit of some kind, leading through the heavens towards the place where the sun rises in the east. Clearly, the writers of the Quran mixed things up here. In the original source, the sun does not set in the muddy waters, as the Quran would have it, but in the window of heaven. Alexander follows the sun, which leads him to the east, explaining how he ended up there, a passage that is rather opaque in the Quran. We learn that the ground near where the sun rises becomes so hot that to touch it would mean to be burned alive. The local people therefore flee from the rising sun into caves and the waters of the sea. These are the people without shelter whom the Quran mentions. Next, Alexander moves north along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, until he reaches a mountain pass. The locals ask for help against the Huns who live on the other side. Their kings are named Gog and Magog. Their cries are more ferocious than those of lions, and they kill babies and pregnant women. The locals submit to Alexander, and in return he has his Egyptian metalworkers construct a wall of iron and brass, keeping the Huns out. The Quranic account matches this entire passage in every detail. After that comes Alexander's prophecy. He puts inscriptions on the gate of his wall, giving precise dates. It reads that after 826 years, the Huns would break through the gate and plunder the lands. Then, after 940 years, there will come a time of sin and unprecedented worldwide war. The Lord will give a signal to break down the wall, and the armies of the Huns, Persians and Arabs will fall upon each other. Quote, "The earth shall melt through the blood and dung of men." But then the kingdom of the Romans will enter this terrible war, and they will conquer all, up to the edges of the heavens. In closing, Alexander cites the prophet Jeremiah 1:14. "And evil shall be opened from the north upon all the inhabitants of the earth." Clearly, this corresponds closely with the last part of the story of the two-horned one in the Quran. At this point, the story in the Quran ends, but the original Aramaic Alexander legend has one more chapter. In it, Alexander comes into conflict with the Persian king Tubalak in the very south. With the help of the Lord who appears on the chariot of the seraphim, Alexander conquers the king of Persia. Tubalak promises tributary payments in return for a restoration of the borders, but his diviners predict that at the end of times the Romans will kill the king of Persia and will lay waste to Babylon and Assyria. Tubalak gives Alexander the prophecy which says that the Romans will conquer the entire world before handing power to the returning Messiah. These prophecies help us date the original text. In the Aramaic tradition, the Seleucid era, which started in 312 BC, is called the Era of Alexander. Counting 826 years forward gives us the date when the gate of Alexander's iron and brass wall is first breached. We land in the year 514 AD, which coincides with the invasion of the nomadic Sabians. This story has no further significance to the Alexander legend and likely served as a marker for contemporary audiences. Counting 940 years brings us into the year 628 AD, which is the year in which the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius defeated the Persian Empire under the Sasanians. In that year, the Turkic Khazars breached the northern Persian borders and ravaged the lands. The prophecy of the end of times must therefore relate to the Byzantine-Sasanian War. This is in line with the general apocalyptic expectations of the time, and it allows us to date the source text with relative precision. It must have been written shortly after 628 AD. In the years following the war, Heraclius' main focus lay on reuniting Christianity under one roof. Christological debates had fractured the church, particularly the division between the Catholic Church in the West and the Monophysites in the East undermined his legitimacy. The Alexander legend was clearly a propaganda piece intended for the ears of the Monophysites, maybe also the Nestorians. The prophecies that the Romans were the chosen people to rule the earth before the return of the Messiah could come to pass were meant to convince the Monophysites to come back into Heraclius' fold. So if the Aramaic Alexander legend is all about eschatology, what is the purpose of having Alexander go to the four corners of the earth? This becomes clear when we look at the world the way people in the early Middle Ages saw it, with Jerusalem in the center. Alexander's travels make the sign of the cross over the whole world, a symbol for the victory of the Christian empire which is prophesied in the story itself. From detailed descriptions of northern Mesopotamia, we can deduce that this is where the text originates. It was presumably written in or near Edessa, which was right at the center of many Christological infights. After Heraclius' death in 641 AD, the attempts to reunite the Christian church were abandoned, which then also gives us an upper threshold for the writing of the Alexander legend. It therefore must have been written between 628 and 641 AD. The story quickly became widely popular among Aramaic-speaking Christians, so much so that the writers of the Quran had to take a position on the matter. Being part of an anti-Trinitarian sect, they obviously rejected the claim that the Trinitarian Romans were the chosen stewards of the earth and that only they could bring forth the second coming. At the same time, the story was too popular to ignore, so they removed the prophecies regarding the Romans in their version of the story. According to Islamic traditions, the verses regarding the two-horned one were revealed when the people of Mecca went to the Jews in order to get information with which they could test Muhammad's knowledge. Had he existed, this would have been early in Muhammad's ministry, certainly well before 622 AD. As we now know, such an early date is impossible, as the story hadn't been written yet. But could it be the other way around? Could the Aramaic Alexander legend be based upon the Quranic story about the two-horned one? The answer is simple: no, it couldn't. Since it is way more detailed, it would have to be an expansion on the cryptic story in the Quran, an attempt to decipher and interpret it, but it shows no signs thereof. There are no references to the Arabic language, which we would expect in such a case. At the same time, it seems impossible that an Aramaic apocalypse written around 630 AD would be drawing from Arab traditions, and of course, the very specific political message would not make any sense in this scenario. On the other hand, everything makes perfect sense if we conclude that the Quranic text was copied from the Aramaic original. The passage in the Quran opens with the following verse: "And they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I will recite to you about him a report." This verse was not directed at a prophet Muhammad, rather it has to be read literally. This is a preacher talking to his congregation. Should they be challenged by other Christians with the story of Alexander and that it clearly demonstrates that God favors the Trinitarian Byzantines, then they are supposed to respond with the Quranic retelling of the story, which contains no such claims. Which brings us back to the beginning of this episode. A Macedonian king who was dead for almost 1000 years by the time these stories were written proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Islamic traditions surrounding the revelation of Surah 18 verses 83 to 102 are clearly false. Furthermore, we are looking at a fictional, ahistoric Byzantine propaganda piece which made its way into the Quran, burying the idea of its divine origin.